For over 5 decades, Jodie Foster has stood as one of Hollywood's most extraordinary forces. She was the girl who grew up before our eyes, the woman who defied the system, and the legend who proved that talent could outshine fame. But today, there's a silence around her that no one can quite explain. Fans are confused. The industry is worried. And those who knew her best say there's something heartbreaking happening. Something she's not saying out loud. There are no headlines, no clear reason. Just a strange, painful quiet. And that silence, more than anything, has left millions asking the same question. What happened to Jodie Foster? Because when someone who once carried the strength of 1,000 stories suddenly grows so still, you can't help but feel that something is breaking behind that calm. This is the tragedy of Jodie Foster. And it's far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Before she was an icon, she was just a little girl with a book in her hand and a mind far too sharp for her age. Alicia Christian Jodie Foster was born on November 19, 1962, in Los Angeles, the youngest of 4 children in a family already familiar with the entertainment world. Her mother, Evelyn Brandy Foster, was a film publicist who saw something extraordinary in her daughter before anyone else did. At just 3 years old, Jodie appeared in her first commercial for Coppertone sunscreen, a smiling, sun-kissed child who would unknowingly become one of Hollywood's brightest stars. By age 6, she was acting regularly in television series like Mayberry RFD and Gunsmoke. But Jodie wasn't like other child actors. While many sought attention, Jodie sought understanding. She memorized scripts effortlessly, asked directors why scenes mattered, and challenged adults with a quiet intellect that both impressed and intimidated them. By the time she was 10, she could switch from playful laughter to emotional depth in a heartbeat. Directors said she had the instincts of a 40-year-old trapped in a child's body. Her mother became her guardian and protector, always close, always watching. She kept Jodie's education a priority, ensuring that the little girl who worked on film sets all day still went home to study French and mathematics. And that discipline would shape everything that came after. Then came Taxi Driver, 1976. At just 13, Jodie was cast by Martin Scorsese as Iris, a child prostitute alongside Robert De Niro's lonely, disturbed Travis Bickle. It was a performance that left critics speechless, raw, fearless, unsettling. She didn't just act, she inhabited the role. And when the film hit theaters, the world stopped and took notice. Oscar nominations followed. Fame exploded overnight. But behind that fame was a quiet discomfort. The unease of a child growing up far too fast in an industry that devoured innocence. The performance had made her a legend. It had also marked the beginning of her lifelong struggle with the very fame she had earned. Hollywood loved her, perhaps too much. Reporters crowded her door, directors begged her to star in their next projects, and magazine covers declared her the future of cinema. But Jodie, still a teenager, never seemed entirely at ease. She once said in an interview, "People talk about fame like it's a gift. But when it happens too soon, it feels more like a theft." And she was right. Fame stole her privacy, her normalcy, and the simple right to grow up without scrutiny. By the time she reached high school, Jodie was already a household name. She was balancing her studies with film shoots, red carpet events, and interviews, all while trying to stay grounded in a world that often blurred the line between admiration and obsession. She graduated with honors and made a bold decision to step away from the industry and pursue higher education. She enrolled at Yale University, majoring in literature. For many, it was an unexpected choice, but for Jodie, it was survival. At Yale, she finally found something close to peace. She could walk across campus, study in silence, and be known not as the actress from Taxi Driver, but as Jodie, a student, a thinker, a young woman searching for meaning. Yet, even as she tried to escape the spotlight, the shadow of her early fame followed her. Her classmates whispered her name in awe. Professors treated her gently, aware of the celebrity sitting in their classroom. The world had seen Jodie Foster as a child prodigy, a symbol of artistic fearlessness. But after the Hinckley incident, she became something else entirely, a survivor hiding in plain sight. For several years, she took a step back from major roles, focusing on smaller, more thoughtful projects. The industry wondered if she would ever return to the center of the stage. Hollywood moved fast, it always did, but Jodie's silence had a weight to it, a kind of quiet rebellion against the machine that had nearly destroyed her. Then, in 1988, she returned with The Accused, a film that changed everything. Playing Sarah Tobias, a young woman fighting for justice after a brutal assault, Jodie delivered a performance that was raw, real, and almost painfully personal. Her portrayal wasn't just acting, it was catharsis. She showed the world what survival looked like, not through words, but through trembling strength and defiance. When she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, the applause was thunderous, but Jodie stood at the podium reserved, calm, and slightly distant, as if she was still somewhere else, still processing the cost of that victory. Critics hailed her as one of the finest performers of her generation. But her triumph wasn't about the award, it was about reclaiming herself. After years of being reduced to headlines and tragedy, she reminded everyone that she was an artist first. 3 years later, she did it again. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991, would cement her status as a legend. As FBI trainee Clarice Starling, she embodied intellect and vulnerability in equal measure, matching Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter in psychological depth. It wasn't just a thriller, it was an exploration of human fear, strength and morality, themes that mirrored Jodie's own inner journey. When she won her second Oscar, she smiled, thanked her mother, and quietly returned to her seat. There were no grand speeches, no tears. She had said everything through her work. And yet, as the world celebrated her brilliance, few realized how fragile she still felt inside. Behind that measured composure was a woman still searching for peace, a peace she would soon begin to build behind the camera. For most of her career, Jodie Foster was a mystery to the public. Elegant but elusive, powerful yet private. And when she became a mother, that mystery deepened. In the late 1990s, she welcomed her 2 sons, Charles and Kit. She never revealed details about their father and refused to let their lives become public property. "My sons deserve to grow up without the weight of my fame," she once said. And she meant it. Motherhood changed her. Friends say she smiled more, worked less, and began to see the world with gentler eyes. Her interviews became softer, her tone more reflective. She spoke often about teaching her children independence and kindness, about letting them see the beauty of life away from flashing cameras. Her home in Los Angeles became her sanctuary, filled with books, art, and sunlight. She loved cooking, gardening, and spending long hours reading French literature. In her rare interviews, she admitted she found joy in silence. "I've lived enough for 10 lifetimes. Now I just want to listen." Yet even in this quiet domestic world, the past never fully left her. There were still days when she'd withdraw into herself, still nights when memories of the darker years resurfaced. The cost of surviving fame at such a young age never truly disappears. It lingers like a shadow, always nearby. As her sons grew older, Jodie started to step back from Hollywood altogether. She picked projects carefully, appearing only when the story touched her deeply. She wasn't chasing success anymore. She was chasing meaning. Her fans admired her more than ever, not for what she did on screen, but for how she lived off it, gracefully, courageously, and on her own terms. But what no one realized was that her retreat from the spotlight wasn't just about peace. It was also about pain, a pain she never wanted the world to see. The years ahead would reveal just how heavy that silence truly was. For most of her adult life, Jodie Foster seemed unshakable, a woman who spoke with calm precision, who handled success and pressure with quiet grace. But beneath that surface of composure lay an ocean of emotion that few people ever glimpsed. Jodie had built her entire identity around control. It was her armor, one she'd been forced to wear since childhood. Every interview, every public appearance, every award speech was deliberate. She chose her words carefully, never revealing too much. To the world, she was the definition of poise. To those who knew her privately, she was introspective, analytical, and at times, heartbreakingly lonely. In one rare moment of vulnerability during an interview in the early 2000s, she said, "I've lived my whole life in front of people, but I've always been alone in my head." That single sentence revealed what decades of fame had done to her. The child who grew up on film sets never learned what it meant to be anonymous. She was adored, studied, praised, and scrutinized, but rarely understood. After her monumental successes in the 1990s, Jodie began to turn down major roles. Big studios kept calling, scripts, offers, millions on the table. She declined most of them, choosing projects that spoke to her heart rather than her bank account. Some insiders whispered that she was difficult or overly selective. But in truth, she was simply protecting what little peace she had left. Fame had stopped being a thrill decades ago. Now it felt like a burden, something she carried out of obligation, not desire. Her private journals, as close friends would later reveal, were filled with reflections on solitude, aging, and identity. She questioned the meaning of achievement, the purpose of art, and whether her voice still mattered in a world that seemed louder but less thoughtful. She spoke once about the paradox of her life. "I've played strong women all my life, but strength can be so lonely." It was that loneliness, quiet, invisible, and constant, that became her greatest battle. Yet, Jodie never sought pity. Instead, she transformed that isolation into wisdom. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was protection. Her retreat wasn't defeat, it was survival. By her early 60s, she seemed at peace, but it was a fragile peace, one earned through decades of emotional labor. The tragedy wasn't that she withdrew from the spotlight. The tragedy was that she had to. As the years rolled forward, the Hollywood Jodie Foster once knew began to fade. The studio system that valued storytelling was replaced by franchises, reboots, and endless online content. Social media created a new kind of fame, instant, viral, and often empty. To the modern generation, fame was a lifestyle. To Jodie, it had always been a wound. She watched from a distance as younger actors shared every detail of their lives on Instagram, every thought on Twitter. It baffled her, the hunger for validation, the public oversharing, the loss of mystery. She often said she belonged to a time when actors spoke through their work, not through posts. Her distance from all of it made her an anomaly in the modern entertainment world. She had no public persona beyond what she chose to reveal. She didn't chase trends, didn't craft an online brand. And somehow, that only made her more intriguing. Streaming platforms introduced her classic films to new audiences. Teenagers who had never seen The Accused or The Silence of the Lambs found themselves captivated by her power. Her ability to say more with a glance than most could with pages of dialogue. When she appeared in newer projects like True Detective, Night Country, 2024, younger fans were astonished. "Who is this woman?" they asked. They found her presence magnetic, commanding, intelligent, effortlessly real. But while the world rediscovered her, Jodie remained unchanged. She gave thoughtful interviews about the craft of acting, about authenticity, about time. Her words carried the weight of someone who had seen everything, the best and worst of what fame could offer. Still, there was a melancholy to her tone. In one conversation, she quietly admitted, "Hollywood isn't home anymore. It's just a place I visit." Those who listened carefully could feel it, the distance in her voice, the nostalgia in her smile. She loved cinema, but she no longer belonged to its world. And maybe, she never truly did. The cameras, the red carpets, the flashing lights, they were all relics of another era. Jodie Foster, the brilliant actress who once stood in those lights, now preferred the dim glow of a quiet evening, a glass of wine, and the company of her own thoughts. She wasn't bitter. She was just done with pretending. And in an industry that thrives on reinvention, she remained what she'd always been, entirely herself. When people speak of Jodie Foster, they use words like intelligent, precise, and fearless. But those words barely touch the truth of who she is. Her legacy isn't just about awards or roles, it's about integrity. She redefined what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood. She didn't play the game. She built her own. While others courted fame, she built a fortress of dignity around her art. She proved that intellect could be as captivating as beauty, that stillness could be as powerful as noise. Directors who worked with her often described her as a director's dream. She came to set fully prepared, respectful, and exacting. "She never misses a beat," said Robert De Niro once. "She reads the world in silence." Actors she mentored, especially women, credit her for changing their approach to art and life. Natalie Portman once said that watching Jodie as a child inspired her to act with purpose. Kristen Stewart, whom Jodie directed early in her career, called her the most honest person I've ever met in this business. Yet the irony of her life is that her genius has always been shadowed by her privacy. She gave everything to her craft, her youth, her voice, her emotion, but she gave nothing to the machine that demanded constant access. In an age where fame is currency, Jodie Foster's refusal to spend it has become her greatest legacy. At 63, she stands as both a mystery and a mirror, a reminder that greatness often comes with loneliness, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the quietest. Her story is not just one of success but of survival, of a woman who learned that in order to keep her soul, she had to step away from the noise. The world calls her a legend. But to those who truly understand her, Jodie Foster is something even rarer, a genius who chose silence over spectacle, and in doing so became immortal. By the time Jodie Foster entered her 60s, the glow of fame that once surrounded her had dimmed to a softer, almost ethereal light. She wasn't gone, but she was far, far away from the frenzy that had once defined her. Her last few roles were selective, almost meditative, each one chosen not for prestige or profit, but for meaning. She began to appear less and less on screen, sometimes going years between projects. For her, it wasn't about retirement, it was about peace. She often said that the most rewarding moments of her life now came from the spaces between things. Mornings without schedules, afternoons spent reading, evenings filled with quiet. Still, whenever she did appear, she was as captivating as ever. Her presence carried a calm gravity, her gaze deep and knowing. But those who watched closely began to notice something different. There was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, a fragility that seemed to come not from age, but from introspection. In interviews, she spoke often about time. You wake up one day and realize you've lived most of your story. The pages ahead are fewer, and you just hope they're filled with meaning. Fans found those words haunting. Speculation grew. Was she ill? Was she retiring? Why did she look so melancholic, so thin, so tired? Her representatives denied anything was wrong, insisting that Jodie was simply enjoying her privacy. But the online discussions continued, with fans posting side-by-side photos, her vibrant past alongside her quieter present. To some, it was the natural aging of a legend. To others, it felt like watching the slow fading of a star that had burned too brightly for too long. Jodie's friends described her as contemplative. She spent hours walking alone, writing, painting, and taking photographs of nature. The woman who once lit up the world with her words had now turned inward, expressing herself in silence. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something deeper, something that looked a lot like resignation. The quiet years weren't empty. They were just heavy, with reflection, memory, and the weight of a lifetime lived in the spotlight. As time went on, Jodie's presence in Hollywood became almost ghost-like. There were no announcements, no farewells, just longer and longer gaps between projects, until one day, people realized she hadn't appeared on screen for years. Her absence spoke volumes. She was still seen occasionally, at small art galleries, charity events, or bookstores in Los Angeles. Each time, the photos that surfaced stirred conversation. She looked graceful, but distant, as if she were watching life from the other side of a glass wall. Her close circle said she was working on personal projects. There were whispers of a memoir, quiet rumors of her writing poetry or short stories under a pseudonym. She also took up photography, capturing still moments that reflected her new relationship with the world, quiet, detached, honest. To those who had worked with her, the transformation wasn't surprising. Jodie always lived inside her own head, one friend said. She didn't need the spotlight anymore. She'd said what she wanted to say. Still, fans couldn't help feeling uneasy. For decades, Jodie Foster had been the embodiment of strength, the woman who faced darkness and transformed it into art. To see her disappear so silently felt wrong, almost painful. The industry missed her. Awards ceremonies occasionally mentioned her legacy. Younger actors paid tribute to her in acceptance speeches, calling her the reason they believed in storytelling. And yet, she never showed up to hear those words. The emotional weight of her absence began to settle on her fans like fog. Had she simply grown tired? Or was there something else, something unspoken, that had driven her deeper into solitude? Those questions hung in the air, unanswered, as the cameras that once adored her remained still. The world had lost sight of Jodie Foster, not through scandal or tragedy, but through silence. And sometimes, silence can be the most haunting ending of all. Then suddenly she returned, not on the big screen, but on television. It was an interview that aired on a quiet winter evening, and within hours, it became the most discussed segment of the week. Jodie Foster, at 63, sat across from the interviewer in a simple navy sweater, her silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. There was no glamour, no Hollywood sheen, just honesty. At first, she smiled and laughed, speaking about her early films, her love for literature, and her memories of growing up in a different kind of Hollywood. But as the conversation turned toward legacy, her tone shifted. "I've told my stories," she said softly. "Now I just want to let go of them." The interviewer asked what she meant. Jodie paused. Her eyes seemed to glisten for a moment before she forced a smile. "Time takes us all in its arms eventually. I just want to make peace with that." The audience watching from home felt a sudden stillness. Her voice, normally so composed, cracked slightly on the last sentence. For a brief moment, it felt as though she was saying goodbye, not just to the audience, but to everything she had built. When the interview aired, social media lit up. Fans posted clips with captions like "Something feels off," and "Why does this sound like a farewell?" Others wrote messages of love and concern, recalling her words with tears in their eyes. Within days, millions had seen the interview. And though Jodie herself never explained it, the tone, the sadness, and the distant calm in her eyes left a lingering question in everyone's hearts. Was this her final curtain call? Those who knew her best said she had seemed serene in recent months, perhaps too serene. She spoke often of closure, of passing the torch, of finally finding stillness. For a woman who had spent a lifetime surviving chaos, that stillness felt both beautiful and unbearably sad. It was as if she had been preparing for a goodbye only she understood. In the months following that haunting interview, people who had known Jodie for decades began to share small glimpses of her private world. Not gossip, but quiet reflections of a woman nearing the end of a long and complicated journey. One close friend revealed that Jodie had become more spiritual in her later years, though not in any conventional way. She spoke about energy, about life cycles, about coming full circle. She had started journaling again, writing letters she never sent. Another friend said she often revisited her old film sets, sometimes driving past the studios late at night just to see what memories felt like. She wasn't nostalgic in a sentimental sense, she was trying to make peace with her past, one memory at a time. Her colleagues noticed a certain calm in her, the kind that comes when someone has accepted all that life has given and taken away. She didn't fear aging, nor did she regret her choices. What haunted her, they said, was time itself, how quickly it all had gone. Jodie talked about time as if it were a person, one confidant shared. She'd say, "Time has been both kind and cruel to me. It gave me everything, but it took just as much." Those words echoed the sadness her fans had sensed for years. It wasn't fame or failure that burdened her, it was the quiet reckoning that comes when a life of intensity begins to fade into stillness. She began cutting down on public commitments entirely, spending her days surrounded by books, family, and her dogs. Friends described her laughter as softer now, her conversations shorter. She didn't talk much about the future. "I've done my part," she once told a colleague. "Now I just want to rest in the quiet." No one knew exactly what she meant, and perhaps she wanted it that way. What remained clear was that Jodie Foster, the once unstoppable force of cinema, was gently closing her chapters, not with fanfare or headlines, but with quiet grace. The whispers of her solitude reached every corner of Hollywood, and fans around the world began to realize that they were witnessing something deeply human, the fading of a light that had burned brilliantly for so long. It wasn't the kind of ending people expected. It was gentler, sadder, and far more real. The interview that aired on that quiet winter evening did more than stir curiosity, it awakened a collective worry. Across the world, fans, journalists, and fellow artists began to voice their unease. Something about Jodie Foster's tone, her softness, her resignation, had pierced through the usual layers of Hollywood performance. Within hours, hashtags like #PrayForJodie and #JodieFosterForever began trending. Clips from her earlier interviews, the ones where she had laughed about aging or joked about disappearing someday, resurfaced, but now they carried a darker, more emotional weight. People began connecting dots that perhaps weren't meant to be connected. They compared her recent words with her older ones, noticing the slow evolution of a woman coming to terms with something profound. Maybe loss, maybe fatigue, maybe an ending she had long accepted. News outlets tried to reach her representatives for comment, but there was no reply. Weeks went by without a single public sighting. In the absence of answers, the world turned to reflection. Fans began sharing stories of how her movies had changed their lives, how The Accused had given them courage, how Contact had made them believe in wonder, how Silence of the Lambs had introduced them to strength disguised as vulnerability. Her colleagues posted tributes, not obituaries, but love letters. Director Martin Scorsese called her one of the few artists who turned pain into art without ever losing her humanity. Actress Jodie Comer wrote, "Watching her made me believe that truth could exist in fiction." It was clear, Jodie Foster was more than a performer. She was a mirror through which millions had seen themselves, vulnerable, brave, flawed, and searching. But as the tributes poured in, one feeling united them all: heartbreak. The world wasn't mourning a death, it was mourning a silence. A silence so deep, so haunting, that it made people realize how much she had meant to them all along. The tragedy wasn't that Jodie Foster had vanished. It was that she had spent a lifetime giving the world her truth, and now, she seemed to have none left for herself. To understand Jodie Foster's silence, one has to understand the life she lived, a life sculpted by perfection, discipline, and control. From the very beginning, she demanded excellence from herself. Every line delivered, every scene crafted, every emotion drawn, all had to meet her impossibly high standards. It was what made her great, but it also built invisible walls around her. Fame didn't control Jodie, she controlled fame. But control, as she once admitted, can become a prison. When you've lived your life trying to get everything right, she said, you forget how to live when things fall apart. Those words, once dismissed as philosophical musings, now sounded like confessions. In her films, she often played women on the edge, characters who were both powerful and wounded, calm yet broken. Looking back, it was clear that those roles weren't random choices. They were reflections. Mirrors. Each character was a fragment of her, the young prodigy seeking approval, the survivor seeking meaning, the thinker trying to quiet the chaos. Her perfectionism wasn't vanity. It was survival. As a child star, she had been forced to grow up fast, surrounded by cameras, expectations, and judgment. She learned early that mistakes weren't allowed. So she built an armor of discipline. But armor, no matter how polished, is heavy. And over time, it can exhaust even the strongest soul. By her 60s, the woman who had once thrived on control began to crave surrender. She spoke less about ambition, more about freedom, not from others, but from herself. In her quietest moments, she seemed to understand that perfection had been her greatest gift, and her greatest curse. "I spent my life chasing flawless moments," she once told a friend. "Now I just want peace, even if it's imperfect." And in that single admission, the world saw the heartbreaking truth. The cost of her brilliance had been solitude. Behind every public image lies a private storm. For Jodie Foster, that storm had always been there, just hidden beneath the surface of her composure. Fame, which had once felt like purpose, had slowly become noise. She had spent decades being watched, studied, judged, and yet so few truly saw her. Friends recalled moments of quiet sadness, the way she sometimes avoided mirrors, or how she'd drift into thought in the middle of a conversation. She wasn't unhappy exactly, but she carried a weariness that words couldn't describe. She'd say things like, "I don't want to be seen anymore, not like this," one friend revealed. At first, we thought she meant the media. But I think she meant something deeper. It was the exhaustion of being defined, by roles, by headlines, by expectations. She wanted anonymity, but fame had written her name in light. And light, once cast, cannot easily be reclaimed. The struggle wasn't physical, it was existential. She often spoke about disappearing, but not in a dramatic sense. She meant it spiritually, to dissolve the boundaries between self and world, to find quiet in an age of noise. "When I go, I just want to go quietly," she once said. "No drama, no spectacle. Just quiet." Those words haunted those who remembered them. It was as though she had been rehearsing her exit from the public eye for years, one whisper at a time. As she aged, she stopped attending events altogether. Her absence wasn't rebellion, it was release. The woman who had once stood in front of millions now found her truth in solitude. But that solitude, as peaceful as it appeared, was tinged with sadness. For those who loved her, it felt like watching someone slowly walk into the ocean. Not in despair, but in surrender. The unseen struggle of Jodie Foster wasn't fame or failure. It was the eternal search for peace in a world that never stops watching. Then came the silence, deep, complete, and final. No new appearances. No interviews. No statements. Just quiet. Months passed. Then years. And the absence became its own kind of story. Documentaries began to appear, analyzing her life, her words, her legacy. Clips from her films were replayed as if people were trying to decode messages she had left behind. The line between her art and her truth had blurred completely. And slowly, people began to realize something profound. Her silence was not abandonment. It was communication. By stepping away, Jodie Foster had said more than she ever could with words. She had lived a life of expression, now she chose stillness. She had lived under constant scrutiny, now she chose invisibility. The industry mourned her absence like a death, yet also revered it as an act of rebellion. Few had ever walked away from Hollywood with such grace, fewer still had done it without bitterness. Her former co-stars spoke of her often, their voices breaking when recalling her discipline, her humor, her fierce integrity. Directors called her a visionary who taught them to find truth in the quiet moments. And though no one truly knew what had become of her, whether she was writing, painting, or simply watching sunsets somewhere far away, her spirit lingered. Not in gossip columns or red carpets, but in the stillness of the stories she left behind. Her silence became her final masterpiece. A haunting reminder that sometimes, the loudest message is the one left unspoken. And so, at 63, the tragedy of Jodie Foster was not in her fall, but in her fading, her graceful disappearance into the shadows she once illuminated so brightly. It was not death that broke the world's heart. It was her silence. The day the world realized that Jodie Foster might never return was a day heavy with silence. A silence that echoed across film studios, award stages, and the hearts of millions who had grown up watching her. No official announcement came. No farewell tour, no final film, no grand speech. She simply stepped away. And somehow, that made it even more heartbreaking. Hollywood, a place built on spectacle, didn't know how to handle her kind of exit. There were no headlines screaming scandal or tragedy. Just absence. And in that absence, the industry began to feel something it rarely felt: humility. Directors, actors, and producers, people who had spent decades chasing her precision and grace, began to speak about her with a kind of reverence usually reserved for legends long gone. Christopher Nolan called her the purest actor of her generation, the one who never needed the frame to shine. Meryl Streep said tearfully in an interview, "She taught all of us that silence can be a performance too." Tributes poured in from all corners of the world. Film festivals held screenings of Contact, Taxi Driver, The Accused and Silence of the Lambs, not as nostalgia, but as a way of saying thank you. Audiences filled theaters to watch her again, and in those darkened rooms, something sacred happened. When her younger self appeared on screen, fierce, intelligent, alive, people didn't just see an actress. They saw a mirror of humanity itself, the confusion, the courage, the loneliness, the grace. Across social media, messages flooded timelines. "She was the first woman I ever saw on screen who looked strong and scared, just like me. Jodie Foster taught me that thinking deeply wasn't weird, it was brave. She made silence powerful." And as people revisited her life and work, they began to understand the quiet tragedy that had always lived between her lines. The story of a woman who gave everything to art, and then vanished into peace when she had nothing left to give. Her departure wasn't about loss. It was about completion. But still, for the millions who adored her, the heartbreak was real. Because even though she left behind an extraordinary legacy, the world wasn't ready to let her go. The lights of Hollywood dimmed a little that year, not because of scandal or sorrow, but because one of its brightest stars had simply decided to stop shining. And somehow, that silence, that choice, was more powerful than any goodbye could ever be. In the months and years that followed, Jodie Foster's story began to take on a life of its own. It wasn't just about her career anymore, it was about her philosophy. People began to write essays, host podcasts, and teach university courses about her. Not only as an actress, but as a thinker. Her interviews were replayed and analyzed line by line, revealing a woman far ahead of her time. She had always spoken about solitude, but now, her silence had given it meaning. She had always spoken about authenticity, but now, her disappearance became the ultimate act of it. What Jodie Foster taught the world wasn't about fame or art. It was about being. In an age of noise, she chose quiet. In a world obsessed with exposure, she chose invisibility. In a culture that rewards constant connection, she chose introspection. "You don't owe the world your life," she once said. "You owe it your truth, and once you've given that, it's okay to rest." Her words became a kind of mantra for a generation drowning in visibility. Psychologists, writers, and spiritual leaders began to reference her in talks about burnout and the value of solitude. Her story became a case study, not in fame, but in peace. Even her fans began to see her absence differently. What once felt like abandonment now felt like liberation, a kind of bravery that most people never find. She had not disappeared. She had simply arrived, at a place beyond applause, beyond expectation, beyond the gaze of the world. Jodie Foster's legacy became something rare and timeless, a reminder that the truest measure of success isn't how loudly you're celebrated, but how quietly you can live with yourself when the applause fades. And perhaps that's what made her story so achingly human. She wasn't running from the world, she was returning to herself. If Jodie Foster's story touched you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more videos from Hollywood. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that reveals the untold truths behind your favorite stars.